Hello, I'm Adam Bandt. I'm the Member of Parliament for Melbourne and the leader of the Australian Greens. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak to you today and to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne and pay respects to First Nations owners past, present and emerging. I want to acknowledge all of those people working in First Nations health and particularly the growing number of First Nations GPs that the 2020 Health of the Nation report brings to our attention. We have so much work to do to close the gap, and your contribution is so important and so desperately needed. We must address the legacy of our settler history, which is the shameful health circumstances of our First Nations peoples. We must put treaty, truth, justice and self-determination at the heart of all policy, including health policy. The Greens want to see more resources and workers in First Nations community-controlled health services, and communities put at the centre of decision-making about the structural disadvantages that they face. We also want to see health practitioners in the mainstream able to offer cultural safety to First Nations peoples. And as we launch the 2020 Health of the Nation report today, I also want to acknowledge and thank all GPs for all your work in supporting the health of our communities, but in particular for your vital work over so many months on the front line of the COVID response this year. When you compare our situation here to other countries around the world, we know that we've got a lot to be grateful for in the work of you and your colleagues in practices across the country, our first responders. When I became leader of the Australian Greens, the first thing I wanted to put my stamp on was to elevate the three challenges of the jobs crisis, the inequality crisis, and the climate crisis, and explain how they could be solved through a Green New Deal, a government-led plan of investment and action that tackles the multiple crises that we're facing all at once. And then the waves of COVID-19 overtook the globe. But when you think about it, what COVID has done is to expose many of the underlying problems that are the legacy of decades of failed social and economic policy. As COVID took over our lives, we saw the impact on the most vulnerable. Older Australians living in poorly resourced and regulated aged care sector, a growing workforce of part-timers, casuals and gig economy workers whose low wages and precarious circumstances meant that they had little choice but to keep turning up for work, even at risk to their own health and of those around, the health of those around them. A let-it-rip housing market with costs ballooning beyond many people's reach, and government's reluctance to properly fund the public housing sector so that people had stable, affordable and healthy housing options. Trade and industry policies were exposed that have seen Australia lose its manufacturing base and run short of local provision for essential items like PPE for the health workforce as well as essential medicines. All of this culminated at the same time as the visceral manifestations of the climate crisis with a summer of horror. People displaced, homes burnt to the ground, cities and towns blanketed in smoke for weeks, and essential habitat for our precious wildlife destroyed. We know that the health impacts of global heating will present themselves to GPs, who will be some of the first responders to heat distress, poor air quality from smoke and dust, injury from extreme weather events, and sadly, more novel diseases. We also know that psychological distress from the social, economic and environmental conditions that we're living in is a rapidly growing problem. The Health of the Nation report again confirms the growth of psychological presentations to GPs, and it's the largest group of presentations that you're seeing. While other health issues vary across age, gender and region, psychological issues remain consistently high across all these demographics. I met a 17-year-old student in Canberra a little while ago who said that she can't think more than a year ahead because when she tries to think about what the climate crisis will do to her life in 5 or 10 years' time, it all gets too much. We're robbing children of their future. We're also robbing them of their present. Scott Morrison calls this needless anxiety, but I think it's actually a very normal reaction to some very worrying science. These young people are watching the climate crisis unfold before their very eyes, and they know that they're going to suffer the consequences of a collapsing civilization if our generation fails to rise to the challenge. They also know that targets in 2050 are next to meaningless unless there's strong action in the next 10 years, because it may be that in the next 10 years is when we tip over the cliff. As we speak, parts of Antarctica are melting so quickly that if they pass tipping points, they'll lock in 3 to 4 metre sea rises this century. That's during my young daughter's lifetime. If we don't act by 2030 and have strong 2030 targets and stop opening up new coal and gas fields and mines, it'll be too late. The Green New Deal is about converting that anxiety into action and ambition, a tangible plan of how we can build a future that we can all prosper in. A key to that prosperous future is being able to offer the best healthcare in the world to all our citizens. Our Greens vision is for universal access to healthcare so that there's no gap and no out-of-pocket costs. We've got a plan for chronic disease, to place an increased focus on preventative health, and to bring dental health into the Medicare system. Healthcare is a funding choice for governments. At the moment, the government can find $7.8 billion a year to subsidise the fuel costs of the mining industry, another $6.6 billion per year for rebates on private health insurance, and a massive $43 billion per year on defence contracts that could be directed into the public health system. At the same time, some of our biggest mining companies are paying no tax at all. We could have a fully funded universal public health system in this country. It's just a question of will. GPs remain the most common first port of call for people and the most regular contact point in the health system. The viability of practices and the health of GPs is a concern for the Greens. We still haven't got the funding for primary care and general practice right. We still haven't matched the funding for patient need and care with general practice viability. The Health of the Nation report again sets this out as a key challenge. In 2019, the Greens committed to invest $4.7 billion over this decade to lift the Medicare freeze in full and to protect bulk billing, including investing in life-saving diagnostic tests like X-rays and MRI scans. We're concerned that the growing size of practices creates access issues for some patients who may have to travel further. But we also see technologically enabled practice as a real opportunity for improving access as well as viability. Telehealth must be here to stay and must evolve to help us manage the complex interplay between parts of the system. But the key to all this is getting the budget measures in place to fund the system that Australians deserve. So thank you again for inviting me to speak to you all today. My goal now is to fight for the future. Core to that is a health system that is world-class, has universal access, and where our health outcomes aren't based on how much we can pay. And in order to deliver on that, we need a world-class health workforce with GPs and nurses at the forefront. The Greens will always be fighting for affordable, accessible and high-quality healthcare. That's why we need a Green New Deal for Australia where we can deliver a future for all of us. Thank you.